This week on Talking Squash, we're here with Martin Heath, former world number 4 squash player and performance director of Squash Canada. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, why are you here today, Martin, in London, Ontario?
So, as part of my role as high performance director, I made an agreement with the players that I was going to come and see them in some tournaments here and there. There was no official contract, but it was so that's an easy one.
Right.
So between Rochester and Toronto, it's only a few hours each way. So, and I get to see 7 Canadian players play.
Right. So you're responsible for both the men and the women now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not necessarily national coach, so my role is high performance director. So I'm meant to have an overview, but one of the roles is really to kind of take care of the national team players and the national team. So to see them as much as possible. They might have personal coaches, which they do. So I'm offering to help them, but if they've got a coach watching on the webcast and then they talk to their coach between games, then I don't get involved. So there's just a chance for me to see how they're improving. I work with most of the guys and the girls in summer in Toronto, so it's kind of nice to see them in competition now.
Right. And how long have you been the director now in Canada?
About 4 months, since May 1st, I believe.
Right. So you haven't really been able to put your print on the team any.
Well,
right,
I'll take whatever successes they've had, and then I'll say, well, if there's no success, I'll say, okay, it takes time for that to happen. So the girls did very well in the World Team Championship. One of our funding goals is to finish top 8 for men and women. So the women finished top 8 for the first time in 20 years. So I don't think I can claim that yet, but they did very well. So it's a good start, put it that way.
Right.
But it takes a while. I think individually, I think just kind of, a big part of squash, it's not like a 100-meter race where you've got, a few different techniques and one mentality. It's there's a lot of different variables, a lot of things to learn. So one of my roles really in coaching is to kind of take all that information and funnel it down into these are the most important things to focus on.
Right.
And so I think that clarification I think in the short term that probably is a little bit helpful actually. So every coach has got a different view, but I think that most of the coaches kind of zero in on certain things. To hear that from another person, another former pro and coach, I think is probably helpful.
Right. And you, as being a former pro, you would know a lot about how it is to step onto the court and, compete at 1-to-1 with the opponent in the same box.
Right, that's the game.
Yeah,
that's the game. It's confrontational.
Right.
And usually confrontational because you don't look at your opponent that many times. You kind of try and avoid that eye contact, but you're competing for the same space, and it's very physical. And the person that seems to take that space better, whether by suggestion or by force or by tactical awareness, then tends to win the match.
Right. Now, what kind of person would it be a winner? Like a world number 1, what kind of person would you have to be?
Ooh, good question. In general or in squash?
In squash, I feel like we talked a little bit about this before. I mean, squash is very different from other sports, right? Where it's like very individual in the same box.
So I suppose physically, just start off with physically because that's the easiest, most obvious thing. You look at something like tennis, you see obviously height is a massive advantage, but you tend to find the guys, the optimum is 6'1", 6'2", something like that. So the Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, that kind of thing. In squash, it's kind of similar. You do have a lot of these taller players, but you do tend to find that if you are a very strong player, you need to have a fairly low center of gravity as well. So you've got to change direction quickly and from the tee or from anywhere else. And so you tend to find that there's an optimum of kind of round about 6 foot, 6'1" as well. It's fairly similar to tennis. So I would say that's the first kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's probably a bigger range in squash. You can be 5'9" as a guy, maybe 5'6" as a girl, and you're probably going to be fine. You just adjust your game, and anything above about 6'4" is probably a liability, I would say. So anyway, that's the physical part.
And how tall is James Willstrop?
So he's 6'5".
He's 6'5", so you would say he would be outside of what normally would fit in the...
I would say he had to make a massive adaptation in his training to cater for that.
Right.
And he's very low and hunkered, and he's vegan, and he doesn't carry any excess weight at all. And he's a heavy guy,
right.
And he adjusts his game to how he plays. Any taller than that, than Cameron Pelly,
yeah.
I think he might be 6'6", and so incredibly good ball striker, and probably the best ball striker on the tour actually. And so again, you have to have this other skill to kind of maybe compensate in some way. So you can take advantage of players. So in that way, if their center of gravity is a little bit higher than usual.
Right. So can you maybe talk about what you want to do now with being the director in Squash Canada, how do you want to create these winner types that potentially could have Canada on the squash map again as having a world number one or top 5 or?
So, well, let me explain a little bit. So, it's a fairly unusual system as far as I'm concerned. I haven't seen it before. It's kind of this federal system where at the moment there's no centralised training facility, and there's no members of Squash Canada other than the provinces and territories. So you'll join Squash Ontario, and then Squash Ontario will be one of the members of Squash Canada. So we're meant to provide the overview, but yet Squash Ontario or Squash Quebec or Squash Alberta, they run the programs essentially. So I'm meant to provide the information, the structure and the information to their high performance program for them to run it. So that's what we're navigating right now. Is like, what's the best way for me to be able to do that, make the most amount of impact in that way.
And that sounds like almost like a insurmountable challenge, right? Like that's how it's set right now, and so maybe you can talk about a little bit more, like what would be the ideal setting.
Like what are things you've learned over the years that you think will be most beneficial to the programs, whether it's physical, the training side, technical side, psychological?
Yeah, junior group, getting juniors in, or getting masses playing, or
I mean, identifying great talent at the start, identifying kids that are just great athletes and great attitude, and they can move around the court and they can hit the ball well enough. I think that's probably the first step. And then getting them into a program fairly quickly. It's not, you don't have to be like China necessarily. I've been across coaching the Chinese national team, and they go in at 4 years old, 5 years old, and that's what they do. This is what they do. You're a badminton player 5 years old, and you become Olympic champion by the time you're 24.
Right.
That's kind of there. So obviously that's not the culture here. That's not what we're going to do. So, but there is a benefit to starting early, and there's a benefit to, I wouldn't say specialize too early, but you definitely need to have squash, play squash from when you're probably at least 8 years old.
Right.
At 12, 13, you need to start thinking about specialising, getting away from the basketballs and the soccers and footballs and hockey. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, and at that point, then there's a 15-year. It seems that's the way it is. There's like a 15-year period between when you start taking it very seriously until you become world champion, until you peak. So and then
almost regardless of when you start, like 15 years in, that's when you're like.
That seems to be what it is. Right. So if you look at the players that were winning and reaching the final of the world, let's say the British Open, which is the unofficial world championships for under 13s, let's say, there's a high retention rate and a high success rate from players that reach the final of these tournaments that they eventually become top players when they're maybe a little bit earlier than 28, but the average is 28 years old. That's when people peak, men and women. So at 27, 28.
And was this true when you were playing as well?
I didn't look into the stats. I did now. I mean, I don't know in great detail. I could probably be more detailed.
I just asking because I think nowadays you see players extending their careers and doing exceedingly well into the mid-30s.
Right. It's a good point. Well, there's more money in the game. I mean, that's certainly from when I was around. There's the tour is better. There's more tournaments. I think there's a greater audience. I'm not too sure, but certainly with Squash TV, there's a more consistent audience anyway, and there's more sponsorship and more tournaments. So naturally, it's more money, and players are going to make more money. So I think you can make a decision to stay in the sport longer. At a certain point in your life, when you reach 30, probably other things become more important than just traveling around and being a kind of troubadour. And so families and things like career and things like that. So you need to make a value judgment on your situation around that time. And I think players can keep that going at that point. They don't feel the need. They can carve out another 6 or 7 years at that point and make a really good living.
Right.
And you still have to obviously move on at some point, but it's an easier decision now.
Right. At what time did you stop playing?
I think so. I was late because I went to college. I was late starting, so I think it was around I had about 10, 11 years where I was pro. So I was probably 31, 32 when I finished up.
Okay.
I was in
seems like a good age to stop playing squash. I mean, I'm 43 and I feel the pain of playing squash every day. So
Right. I needed that advice at the time. I needed you to call me.
Yeah.
It's probably time now.
yeah.
So you reached world number 4. What are the things, and as Peter had asked you, and you said you finished your career at 31, 32, what are some of the things that you think would have been, had they been available to you, would have extended your career or made you actually take your game to that world number 1 that you obviously wanted?
I mean, for me personally, I mean, I was, and this is a little bit of a trait of squash players. I was very independent, very stubborn. You know, just kind of had to do it my own way, and I think that actually that managed to get that was probably my competitive advantage in some way. Like I think that probably separated me because I was able to go away and hit balls and train and to find something extra that maybe players in a group aren't going to find. So, but at a certain point, that becomes a limitation. So I think that was the case for me. At a certain point, you're your own voice and own coach. I mean, you need to hear other voices, obviously, and I probably needed some direction at some point. So I would say that you know, if you're talking about how to apply that to a system, which is maybe the next question, is certainly my job as high performance director, is that you want all the players to have this kind of independent streak and be pretty stubborn and kind of, you know, want to find that competitive advantage. Then you want them to be like that, but you also want them to have access to resources and advice, and you know, without it being overbearing necessarily, because you want these kind of independent traits in squash players. That seems to be what, because it's very individual. Like the way that you play is very individual. You adapt your own. You know, that's the reason that you can have 5'8" male players and 6'5" male players. It wouldn't happen in most other sports. So you adapt your style. So you need to be kind of single-minded in some way. So for me, I felt at a certain point, like, well, looking back anyway, it's like I needed some direction. I needed someone to say, okay, it's great you've got this stuff, but you know what, you need to actually focus on this, this, and this. And these are the things that are going to make you, you know, a great professional, not just a great player, but a great professional. So you can do it time and time and time again and make a career out of it and sustain it.
Do you think these things are more readily available now than they were then, or do you think it was just you weren't interested in looking at those as avenues to improve for you then?
I think there was no hybrid system at that point. It was either you're in a group and you kind of run it as this kind of, you know, relatively disciplined militaristic kind of thing, and you listen to everyone that's giving you advice, and it's great that this exists, but there wasn't much kind of, you know, kind of in between. You can kind of be independent and then dip in and out, and I don't think that was kind of an idea. Everyone's still trying to figure out how to do this. Okay, countries that are very successful in sport, they seem to be very conditioned, and they've centralized training system, and they kind of take kids from here to there, they win Olympic gold medals, and squash I think is a little bit different. I think you can do that, but you also need a little bit of an independent streak within the players, and that's what I've observed within, you know, looking at all the top players over the last X number of years. Male players, I don't know, maybe you could argue that female players are different, a little bit different. Nicole David came through a system, and she's the most successful player of all time. So I would, you know, but I would look at all the male players, and very, very few of them did that. You know, maybe the Khans, Jahangir Khan, maybe the last one.
Yeah. Do you think this is what drove you to want to become a coach after your career?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of, that was my thing. I just, you know, I analysed the game. I learned to myself. I broke it apart, kind of put it back together again, and then used me as a vehicle to try to test these things out. And so that was kind of, I had this knowledge after I finished. And you got to extrapolate beyond yourself, right? So it's like not everything that worked for me is going to work for everyone else. So it takes a little bit of time to try and, you know, filter that knowledge in some way. But yeah, over a period of time of coaching, I didn't intend to be a career coach. I intended to go into coaching and get an education and move on into something else, but I just ended up loving it, and it ends up that over a period of time I am building up a lot of good knowledge, I suppose.
Yeah. So tell us, what are some of the coaching jobs and positions you've had since you retired?
University of Rochester, I went into coaching college, which is a fairly traditional thing to do in the US, and it's kind of maybe in the end game for a lot of coaches actually. For me it was the start, and so I had, you know, developed a team from, you know, almost having no squash players at all into like a high level team. So that was.
So what ranking was the team when you took it over?
It's 28 pre-season in 2005.
28, and I guess people should know that you, Derek, you coached the UWO squash team, the Western squash team here in Canada. That's the only team that competes with you
That's right.
in the US. So it must be, you know, nice to have a Canadian team down there as well. And
It is great, yeah, from my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know if all the Americans think that's the case, but
yeah,
so this is our league.
but you took it from 28 to 4, I believe.
To one.
One.
actually.
One.
Yeah,
It was
they were-
1 of 1.
They were dominant.
Wow.
They're a bit dominant, but thank you. But no, it was. I mean, that was fun. So that it was a challenge, obviously, and it's a logistical challenge as well. Trying to figure the whole thing out. Coached the U.S. junior team. Did little gigs like coaching the Chinese national team, and then ended up having a role with Scottish squash. And
how long were you with the Scotland team?
2 years, just
2
a
years.
consultancy contract, 2 years. So it was a short period of time. And then it was the high performance role that came up in Canada that made more sense for me.
Yeah.
So it's great to give something back to the Scottish players. It probably would have been, in an ideal world, it would have been better to have a couple more years. But
Right.
but this was a great opportunity being in Canada, and my son is Canadian, my grandmother's Canadian. I've got a big presence in Toronto, so it just made way more sense for me.
Right. But so back to the university, like, do you feel like you can now, because you have these players like all week, and you can train them and coach them.
Right.
I know I've been down there and look at your training schedule, and like you're pretty like much every day you're on the court and doing something, right?
Yeah, pretty much. It's that you can't. There is a limit on how much you can do with the college kids, right? So there's an NCAA manual that tells you how many hours you're allowed to train, and it's
Oh, okay.
it's, because it's Division 3, and what that means in NCAA is that there's an academic focus, and so the sport essentially must fit into this academic paradigm, where it's educational. You're not just trying to win for the college, which you kind of are, but really it's the reason you get paid is as an educator, and so you're trying to provide these opportunities for personal growth,
Right.
and character building, and things like this, and so there is a little bit of branding as well, and taking the team's name and taking the college's name and trying to win in the best possible way. It's not
Yeah.
just about the winning; it's about how you do it.
But I'm asking, like, is it like more of an ideal setting where you're like so hands-on with the guys almost every day or every week, as opposed to like here in Canada where you're like a little bit more
It depends. Actually.
removed from the players at times?
So from my perspective is that one of the greatest changes you can make in your game is change of technique, because that changes everything, right? So once you get that, like, everything changes, and the next thing changes after that. So, but it's difficult to do in college, right? So you have to have a certain kind of mentality. You have to relax, and you have to be able to willing to change, and it takes a little bit of time to do that. So the pros have kind of got that mentality anyway, because they want to improve. Every minute of the day they want to improve. That's what they do. They wake up in the morning, they want to get better by the end of the day. Whereas college players are like, okay, I've got 2 papers to hand in, I've got 6 classes today, I'm trying to train. You just don't have that headspace where you can kind of like try to figure out your position and recoil and your split step and how you hit the ball. Sometimes you can do that, but tends to be not the focus in college. College tends to be teamwork, becoming a better competitor, becoming fitter, and becoming a little bit more structured with your play. So that it's difficult to affect the thing, in my opinion anyway, that can really make a big difference, which is your technique.
Yeah, in the last year, I've coached Western for 4 years now, and last year is when I finally recognized that you can't really fundamentally improve them as players technically the way you think you want to.
Right.
It's just about making them better people, more reliable, more willing to work, team, like you said. That's a big one. This is an individual sport that these kids have been told they're the best since they're little kids, and they've always been focused on themselves, and all of a sudden they get put in this environment with 10, 12, 14 other people that they have to cheer for while they're also competing against them at the same time for positions on the team. So it's a very unique environment in that college squash, but it brings everybody on the team together from what I've seen, and it makes it an unbelievable university experience.
Oh yeah.
So from what you were saying, that you were talking about like how this being the ideal kind of hybrid system for high performance. Do you find that there's good opportunities for people to go through these schools and become pros like Ali Farag did? And
I mean, theoretically, yeah. I mean, I suppose there is, and that is, you know, if you look at this 15-year timeline between becoming, you know, taking it seriously and peaking, you know, you have to factor in these 4 years in college, and so those have to be productive. So that, again, that's one of the challenges, right? So taking these talented kids, it's like, okay, they reach 18, 19, it's like, okay, now you're going to go to college, you're not going to go pro.
Right.
So it's like, well, you have to. I think you lose. I personally think you lose 2 years. But then, if you can really focus, by the time you finish your second year, you know, instead of going and doing an internship at Goldman Sachs, you know, you do an internship on the squash court,
Right.
and you start playing PSA, and you start getting, you know, building your points, building your experience, building your body to be a pro, and start thinking like a pro. So that's my suggestion, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to do that with this current crop of players that are now going off to Harvard and Western and some, one in Rochester actually. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but I think that's how I'm suggesting we tackle this, because we try and help these people to make a decision fairly early on, even before they go to college, that this is what they're going to do. But there's a lot of options, right? You get a Harvard degree, it's going to be tough to go pro after
they're
that.
probably
Right?
going to have a salary that exceeds any of their earnings on the PSA tour, right?
Right. So it's a passion project, right? You got, you know, like the people that are going to do it really want to do it, right? And it's just a question of, you know, how you can help them to achieve that.
Right.
So before we move on, Western's playing Rochester this year. Who do you think's going to win?
It's a good question actually, because you've gotten some great players. You got Liam Marison, you got Elliot Hunt.
Elliot Hunt, yeah.
I mean, you've already got
Will Kuhn.
Will Kuhn. You've already got 3 players that are top class players as well.
Yeah.
So. I mean, top 5 or 6, I think we're going to be pretty competitive. We're also fairly strong top 5 or 6.
Yeah. Well, you guys got us last year, so
It's going to be. I think it's going to be tighter.
yeah.
It'll be a tighter match. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that match.